Good evening and welcome to the special bulletin. Just a couple of hours back, President Trump ordered troops to be deployed and deployed in Washington. He has ordered heavily armed troops and the police to be deployed to prevent further bloodshed, further protests, especially those places where buildings and monuments have been vandalized. According to him, what has happened in the city was a total disgrace, and there's a need to prevent that. As a matter of fact, what he has done is nothing new. Presidents over the years have resorted to this measure many times. But since there is ingrained animosity to Trump, a lot of unnecessary noise is being created. And that noise is being created without caring for the need of the country. As the president said, I'm sending thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop rioting, looting, vandalism, assault, and wanton destruction of property. Now, what's wrong with that? He has very correctly called these actions acts of domestic tourism, and that terrorism on tourism is a result of one African American, George Floyd, being killed. I fully agree that every life is important. I fully agree that Lloyd should not have lost his life. But why do we ignore it that within a couple of hours of Floyd dying, the concerned officer was arrested? President Donald Trump, in a message, has said that the National Guard has arrived at the scene. They are in Minneapolis, fully prepared. And he has already said that George Floyd will not have died in vain. We respect his memory. In a statement earlier, Attorney General has said that it's the responsibility of the state leaders to ensure that adequate law enforcement resources, including National Guard, which is a federal force, where necessity is deployed. So this action has been taken. I also received messages from Democratic senators and representatives condemning this action of the President Trump. According to them, the military is supposed to fight international conflicts and not engage in domestic law enforcement. Well, let me tell them that this is not the first time it has happened. As a matter of fact, it was not only George Abraham Lincoln who did it. George Washington had considered doing it. Madison had thought of doing it. Washington did it. And after that, many other presidents also did the same. President George W. Bush and George W. Bush, respectively, invoked Insurrection Act of 1807, 1807. Imagine it, more than a century back. And they said send federal troops to respond to emergencies. Earlier, President Dwight D. Eisenhower used the act to have the federal troops enforce federal civil rights. Earlier also, President Herbert Hoover and Woodrow Wilson had used federal troops to respond to such emergencies. There are two laws in USA which deal primarily with the use of the federal troops in domestic matters. And the action of POTUS is in no way violating those laws. Under the Insurrection Act of 1870, Congress delegated the authority to the president to call military during an insurrection or a civil disturbance. Now, if this was not a civil disturbance where shops are being looted, people are being killed, then what else is civil disturbance? So when the Democratic representatives and senators condemn this action of President Trump, that shows their lack of understanding. Under one provision of this law, A president can use military to suppress an insurrection to protect the states against domestic violence. And this is exactly what he has done. After the passage of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, another provision was added to this act, and that allows president to use the military without the consent of a state government. So he is not required to take the consent of the governor or the Congress of the state. It's his final decision, and at the most he can be guided by the Secretary of State or by the Attorney General. But that's just advisory note. So 14th Amendment permits the president to suppress, now the word is suppress, any insurrection, any domestic violence, harmful combination or conspiracy with military help. So whatever Trump has done is perfectly within the legal limits, and there is no violation of law. If the state law enforcement is unable to protect the citizens and the criminal conduct obstructs the executions of the law of the land, then the president has to take action to protect those laws. And as a matter of fact, this section was enacted to implement the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship and other legal rights to the African Americans. It does not, I repeat, require a request or even the permission of the affected state. There is another act. I think it's my responsibility today to educate Democratic senators and representatives. The Post-Comitus Act of 1878 defined but did not replace the Insurrection Act. That law was enacted as a post-Civil War reconstruction, and that was said that the military would enable the law enforcement. This law made it illegal for the civilian law enforcement to use military investigators. Civilian law enforcement is state law enforcement, not the federal law enforcement. If you remember, after February 11, 2001 terror attacks, President George Bush used this very act to place armed soldiers throughout USA. His father, George W. Bush, used the instruction law to send federal troops to LA in 1992 to restore order in the city after the rioting erupted when Rodney King was seen on the camera and the police officers were acquitted. Earlier also, the elder Bush had sent federal troops to Virgin Islands at the request of the territorial government in 1989 to restore order from civil unrest. Among the most dramatic events occurred in 1957 when Arkansas Democratic governor tried to face down President Eisenhower, and Eisenhower simply ordered the army to go, take over, and do the needful. And the students who were objecting to that became known as Little Rock Nine. Eisenhower had tried his level best to defuse the matter peacefully, as Trump has tried to, but they failed. So ultimately he took action, and ultimately Trump has taken action. I still remember when Eisenhower in a televised address said that our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misinterpret our nation. Mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decisions of the court. And that is what is relevant today. USA has a lot of enemies who will be gloating over this protests, and as we have seen, China, Europe, everybody is gloating. But mob rule cannot be permitted to override the national interest. So, what Eisenhower said in 1957 is applicable today. But then these are not the only cases. I can quote hundreds of other cases, some of them 1946. It was a Democrat president, Harry Truman, who sent federal troops to act against striking railroad workers. So these Democrats who are talking of socialism, they should remember that their icon, Truman, had used the army to break down a strike. In 1932, President Herbert Hoover sent US troops to disperse a group of World War I veterans. And what was the demand of the veterans? They were seeking bonus payments from Congress, and for that, army was sent. Earlier today, you remember, President Hoover called General MacArthur, and then armed military was led and ordered to march against unarmed veterans. And who were the people along with that? Along with General MacArthur was President the then General Eisenhower and General Patton. Later on in 1919, during the Second World War, President Woodrow Wilson, another Democrat, ordered army to stop race riots in 20 cities in USA. So, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And I'm not blaming the Democratic presidents. They did what was proper, and President Trump is doing what is proper. If you really want to know the detailed history of the use of the army by the various presidents, look to my article tomorrow morning. It will be there. But I'll give all credit to President Trump, who has taken an action to prevent, safeguard the honor, the prestige of the country, and to protect the people from plain gangsterism. This should have been done. And President Trump has shown forbearance for taking action when the things were getting out of hand. Thank you, President Trump, for taking the necessary action. Thank you.